Colonel Dorrian's going to start with a short update on counter-ISIS operations in Iraq and Syria.
Thanks, Eric. It's good to be back answering questions. Good morning. We'll start in Syria and we'll move on to Iraq. The Syrian Democratic Forces and their Syrian Arab coalition continue advancing as they further isolate Raqqa city. They continue to make progress in clearing ISIS fighters from the territory in the vicinity of Tabqa, having cleared territory east and north of Raqqa, where they are now nearing positions to enable their assault to liberate the city. As they've cleared, they've repelled a significant number of ISIS attacks as the enemy struggles to slow their advance. In the last 24 hours, they've cleared 11 square kilometers east of Raqqa and toward Tabqa, where the enemy remains completely isolated. Our partnered forces have encountered tough resistance from ISIS in the area, encountering VBID, direct and indirect fire attacks, as well as the use of human shields, which the enemy continues to use to slow their advance. As we reported earlier this week, coalition and partnered Syrian opposition groups repelled an ISIS attack targeting the Antanf garrison in southern Syria. ISIS initiated the attack with a VBID and 20 to 30 fighters with the ground assault and suicide vests. Coalition and partnered forces engaged and defended against the ISIS attack with direct fire before destroying enemy assault vehicles and the remaining fighters with coalition airstrikes. This is significant because the enemy has a track record of attempting spoiler attacks away from the main effort in an attempt to score propaganda points, which they hope will compensate for their lack of battlefield success against coalition and partnered forces. As in past attempts, they were unsuccessful and lost the fighters and the resources they brought to bear. This result also reflects the readiness of coalition and partnered forces to defend themselves, even when working in isolated areas. Moving on to Iraq, the Iraqi security forces continue making incremental progress on the west side of Mosul, as the enemy has intensified their exploitation of civilians by moving them in larger numbers into harm's way. Notably, the coalition has continued supporting the Iraqi security forces as they clear more deeply into West Mosul's dense urban terrain, where nearly 500 square kilometers of territory have been cleared since operations in West Mosul commenced on February 19th. The 16th Iraqi Army Division continues securing East Mosul as a hold force. The Iraqi Federal Police and Iraqi Emergency Response Division have continued their operations along the Tigris River, although their operations have been incremental due to enemy sniper fire and the use of human shields. The CTS continued progress in the dense urban terrain of the Old City, overcoming direct fire engagements from the enemy. And to the west of the city center, the Iraqi 36th Brigade cleared territory north of Badoush. The Iraqi security forces retain control of both main routes west from Mosul, eliminating enemy freedom of movement. This enemy in Mosul is not going anywhere. With that, I'll be delighted to take your questions.
Colonel, just wanted to sort of clarify something. I believe in February, General Townsend had said Mosul and Raqqa should be retaken in 6 months. It's now April. Is that timeline still possible?
Well, I'm not going to get into the business of predicting timelines. We've continued to make good progress with our partnered forces in isolating the city. The enemy, once they're pinned down there, they're not going to be able to go anywhere. And we're going to continue to hammer them with strikes as our partners move in and retake the city. So General Townsend, I know, has been very clear that it's our intent to do the very best we can to get this done on our watch. None of that has changed. We're doing this as quickly as we can, and one of the reasons for that is because the enemy, any area that they control, there's tremendous human suffering there. So we're going to continue our operations at pace. We'll do those operations as quickly as we can, but I'm not going to get into the business of predicting an end date.
Just a quick question on the relationship with Russia right now. what's going on with deconfliction? What can you tell us about that relationship with U.S. forces and Russian counterparts? Have tensions ratcheted up, especially with some of the diplomatic talk that's happening with Secretary of State Tillerson and President Trump, or are things still proceeding apace with military to military discussions?
Thanks, Ben. We continue conducting our operations at pace. We've continued our strikes in Syria, despite the tensions that were a result of the strikes that were conducted against the Syrian regime. This is something that we're going to continue. The Secretary of Defense made clear that he believes that we're operating in a safe and effective manner, and we'll continue to do that. We can't get into the business of discussing the day-to-day operations with regard to any discussions or lack thereof with regard to the deconfliction line. Doing so from my conversations with the people that are directly involved in that before is that was not a productive thing to do, and that's the reason that we are no longer doing readouts of what those discussions are, and we will not get back into that business. So thank you.
Okay, I understand that, but can you just comment real quick on how the relationship is between U.S. and Russia as far as the deconfliction stuff goes? I mean, are there still conversations happening, and can you talk at all about at what level those conversations are happening?
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't answer that for you. That's exactly what we're just not going to be able to discuss. Again, the Secretary of Defense is satisfied that we're conducting our operations in a safe manner. I know yesterday he told you that he felt that we were adequately deconflicted, and we'll continue our operations and accelerate them any way that we can to get these areas liberated from Daesh.
I think you said that strike operations in Syria are continuing apace. Earlier this week, CENTCOM said that offensive operations had slacked off somewhat in the aftermath of the cruise missile strike in order to do more defensive operations. Can you explain whether things have fully returned to the...
Well, in the last week, from the 4th to the 11th, we've conducted 123 strikes for the operations toward isolating and ultimately liberating Raqqa. So that's a significant number of strikes. You know, we have made adjustments to our operations to account for the potential tensions that resulted from the strikes that were conducted because of the Syrian regime's chemical attacks. But make no mistake, we do plan on continuing our operations, and we do continue to look for ways to accelerate them.
Since the strike on Sharia Air Base, could you tell us whether the number of U.S. troops or the amount of the equipment on the ground in Syria have increased or not?
We continue to remain within our force management level, and we do continue to have troops that come into and out of Syria as necessary in order to conduct operations. As far as the specific numbers that are there, we're not going to do real-time reporting on exact numbers, so I really can't give you a tremendous amount of fidelity on that. What I can say is that there's been no real substantive change in where we're headed, the numbers of troops that we have as a result of what's happened. Turkey has played a tremendous role in rolling back ISIS territorial gains, and that's something that we welcome and would love to see continue. In the meantime, we do continue to do our work with our partnered force to isolate Raqqa, and that city is going to be liberated.
Is the SDF at this point, are they properly equipped to carry out that liberation? And is there anything additional equipment-wise, backing-wise that they might need to defeat ISIS in Raqqa?
Well, as you know, the coalition has brought additional firepower into Syria in order to support the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Syrian Arab Coalition in their advance. That comes in the form of Marine artillery and also Apache gunships, which have been instrumental in supporting their advance in areas like Tabqa and in and around the areas that surround Raqqa. So we've brought those to bear. As far as what additional other capabilities might be brought in, I think that's a conversation for another day.
You mentioned the exploitation of civilians in West Mosul. While you were away, Colonel Skoraka told us about a video that he said showed civilians being smuggled into a building in ISIS where, in West Mosul, where they would then become casualties if an American or coalition strike was conducted on that building. But we haven't seen that video. Do you know what happened to it? And I have another question.
Yep, I know that the video was sent to U.S. Central Command headquarters for further review. I believe that's probably where to follow up with regard to the release timeline, because my understanding is preparations are being made, or review is underway there as far as whether that'll be released and at what time it will be released.
On the question of whether strikes have been scaled back in Syria, I briefly glanced at the strike summary today, and it was a particularly small number of strikes in Syria. Is that because of weather, deconfliction problems, or force protection?
Yeah, in any given day, the number of strikes will fluctuate, David, and all the factors that you described could play a role. So we've had some bad weather the last several days, and I think we're going to have a few more days of very tough weather, but I would say any opportunity that we have to conduct strikes or to accelerate them in order to support our partners' advance, we're going to take that opportunity and do so. We're going to get this done as quickly as we can. We're going to conduct our strikes to support our partners, because one of the things that's very important to understand is that millions of people have been able to return to their homes because of the rollback of ISIS territorial gains. And a lot of the reason for that is the coalition airstrikes that have supported our partners as they've taken that territory back. There just wouldn't be anywhere near the number of people that have been able to return to their homes without those strikes, and I think that's a very important point for people to understand.
What is the principal ISIS tactic that they're using in an effort to slow Iraqi forces' movement into West Mosul?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I would say no single tactic. They have a layered defense, and they've had 2 years to build it. Unfortunately, one of the ones that's most problematic and difficult is their use of human shields. They've intensified their efforts to bring civilians into harm's way. This is something that is a despicable and cowardly tactic. But make no mistake, they had 2 years plus to dig elaborate defenses. We've seen them use commercial off-the-shelf drone technology. We've seen them use snipers. We've seen them use VBIDs. And now, as we move into this very dense urban terrain on the west side of Mosul, where the roads may not even really be qualified as what most reasonable people would call a road. They're so narrow that it channelizes the advance for the Iraqi security forces. That combination of things, explosives, booby traps, snipers, the use of civilian shields, just makes it very slow and difficult going. The Iraqi security forces continue their advance, but it's very, very difficult. And it's just going to remain so for a while.
You said that when you were referencing the number of strikes near Raqqa this week, that that there were adjustments to operations to account for tensions following the strikes last Thursday. What kind of, can you give us an example of how those tensions may be manifesting? What are you seeing that shows tension?
Well, you've seen the public statements. I don't have to regurgitate those for you, but what I would say is when you see those types of public statements and you know that you're doing something that changes the dynamic, it's just appropriate to make sure that you're taking appropriate measures to account for that. We don't want to be reckless, and we don't want to have some type of incident that would cause a miscalculation or some type of unintended incident. So I probably cannot get deeply into exactly what the adjustments are in the interest of force protection and maintaining operational security, but I would say that it is certainly appropriate to say we made some adjustments to what our forces in Syria were doing to account for the fact that the strikes against the Syrian regime chemical capability did increase tensions there.
I'd like to ask you to try to be as precise as you can. You just said that you hope to get back to normal operations as quickly as you can in Syria. So is the downturn specifically in airstrikes that continues right now due to force protection, deconfliction, plus weather? Because you've just told us that you're not at normal operations.
Yep, I think I've probably been about as specific as I can, Barbara. We have experienced some very tough weather. We have made some adjustments based on force protection and the increased tensions. All those things have to be taken into account. But make no mistake, we do plan on accelerating any time that we're able. And again, as I've said many times, any ISIS resources in Syria or Iraq, regardless of where they are subject to attack by coalition air, artillery, whatever resources that we can bring to bear to bring about their destruction. So fighters, resources, anything that the enemy is using to resist the advance of our partnered forces, all those things are subject to attack, and we'll take every opportunity that we can to safely and with precision destroy those capabilities.
You had said on deconfliction at the beginning, your words, it was not productive to talk about it. Can you please explain what is not productive? Why is it not productive, in your words, to talk about it? And you also described Mosul fighting right now as incremental. So I take that to mean it's not going as planned. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you meant about incremental as well as not productive to discuss deconfliction?
Yep, the military-to-military discussions between us and Russia on deconfliction previously, having day-to-day discourse about what those discussions are is a departure from their purpose. Their purpose was always to conduct those discussions to protect safety of flight, not as some type of effort to do public statements or that sort of thing. And so these are discussions that we just want to keep focused on what they are intended to do, safety of flight. So we're not going to get into the day-to-day discussions anymore, and that's just how we'll have to do it from here on out. With regard to incremental in Mosul, that word is inaccurate description of what's happening. The Iraqi security forces do continue to advance, so we knew that it was going to be very difficult. We've been saying for months that the enemy's had an opportunity to dig elaborate defenses, that it was going to be very hard. We've said for many months that as we got into the old part of the city, the dense urban terrain there, that it would be extraordinarily difficult. And what we're seeing is exactly what we expected to see. So I'm just trying to give you an accurate description of what's happening. I don't want to say that, hey, they continue to advance at pace, when in reality it's very, very slow and very, very hard, and it's gut-busting, difficult fighting between our forces and theirs. But our forces and the Iraqi security forces continue to make progress. It's very slow. It's very tough. One of the reasons for that is because we want to do it in a manner that protects civilian life. Prime Minister Abadi's been very clear on that, and it's been an enduring principle of the campaign throughout. So if it has to be done slow, that's how it's going to be done. But we're going to continue.
However, you don't want to talk about it, but you do continue to have, I think you just said, day-to-day discussions with the Russians.
Nope, I didn't say that. I told you we're not going to discuss it.
Explain to us, please, why it's detrimental to talk about the deconfliction talks. You've been talking about them up until now. You've called them useful. You've called them effective. You've said that they've saved pilots' lives. That would lead a lot of people, the fact that you're not speaking about it now would lead a lot of people to believe they're not going on now. Why can't you just say, are the deconfliction talks going on with the Russians through this channel currently, or are they not?
Yeah, I'm not going to get into that. We're not going to discuss it. It's as simple as that. It wasn't productive for us to continue doing it, and so we're not doing it anymore.
Colonel, could you talk about what's been going on in Idlib since the chemical attack? Presumably the Russians and the Syrians are forging ahead to take over that area. How many airstrikes have you seen from either side, ground movements? Just talk about what you've seen since the chemical attack.
Tom, I'm afraid I really can't get into that with you because it doesn't really have a direct relationship to the fight against ISIS. We continue to focus our energy here at Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve on supporting our partners who are isolating Raqqa. So what's happening in Idlib, I think, would probably be best directed to U.S. Central Command. I hope you understand it's just not really our portfolio.
On Mosul, it sounds like what they're doing now is sort of encircling Mosul. Is that correct?
Mosul has been encircled for quite some time. What's happening now is that as the CTS and the Iraqi Federal Police and Emergency Response Division press more deeply into the very dense urban terrain along the Euphrates River and in the old part of the city, the 9th Iraqi Army Division continues clearing territory to the north and to the west of the center of the city, and then reducing the size of the cordon where, you know, and this is the territory that the enemy still retains some degree of freedom of movement. But the freedom of movement is only within that shrinking cordon. They're not going anywhere. They're not going to be able to leave to the west. They are cut off. So the force that's in the west side of Mosul, the fighters that are there, they have really two choices. They can surrender to the Iraqi security forces, or they're going to be killed.
Just to follow up on the activities of the Syrian Air Force, by some assessments, the strike last week wiped out as much as a fifth of their operational aircraft. Have you seen a proportional reduction in their conducting airstrikes? Have you seen any noticeable difference in their air activity? Perhaps are you seeing more Russian involvement to make up for that shortcoming?
Yeah, Paul, I understand your question. I'm afraid it's really not within our portfolio. This is something that's probably best directed to U.S. Central Command. You know, we continue to focus on ISIS. We've not really detected any discernible change in the impact of what we intend to do. We've made some adjustments in the interest of making sure that we account for any increased tensions, but as far as impact of what those strikes are, it's just not directly related to what we are doing.
Separately, we'd seen some reports in recent weeks of ISIS fighters moving south from Raqqa and Mosul into sort of southeast Syria and into west Iraq. Is that a trend that you're still noticing, and do you see any significant sort of massing, or not massing, but sort of rallying of forces there?
Yeah, anytime that the enemy remains under pressure in one area, they are going to try to look for places to go. This is one of the reasons why we have a force in southern Syria at the Entente garrison. They continue to work with partnered forces to further reduce enemy freedom of movement in the open desert, in the areas that are more remote south of Raqqa. So this is something that we continue to build upon. You know, the enemy thought probably that they had a window of opportunity or the potential to conduct a strike where we had forces that were operating in a fairly remote location. They were wrong about their ability to conduct a successful attack. They were routed. Once they made their initial attack, things turned south for them very quickly. And this is an example, working with those partnered forces in some of these remote areas. We're not just working in these major areas like Raqqa and Mosul. We continue to work with our partnered forces in Syria and in Iraq to eliminate these other areas where ISIS might wish to go. We want to make sure that that's a wish.
Colonel, I understand that you're not the releasing authority anymore for this video that purportedly shows ISIS herding people into buildings in Mosul and even executing someone on the spot. But do you think it undercuts the U.S. credibility when you make that kind of allegation of a really spectacular atrocity, a war crime, claim that you have the video to back it up, say that you're going to release it shortly, and then it never gets released because it doesn't appear we're going to see that video anytime soon?
Yeah, the decision to release or not release the video now resides at CENTCOM, so I'll refer you to them with regard to that. What I can tell you is that the atrocities of ISIS are well documented not just by us, but by witnesses on the ground, human rights groups. There is their own releases of videos. They've hung people as an example to others in the western side of Mosul, and they leave them hanging there as an example of what will happen to people who try to escape the city. That's well documented by a lot more than just the coalition.
Quick follow-up. Has there been any change in the assessment that ISIS is using this tactic of forcing groups of people into locations where they will potentially become mass casualties and thereby stoke outrage against the coalition? Has there been any change to the assessment that that's what occurred in this incident in Mosul where so many civilians were killed? And has there been any change in their tactic? Are they still using that tactic?
The enemy does continue to use that tactic. That's among the many things that you see from multiple witnesses, people that have been victims of that. With regard to the specifics of the March 17th strike, that's still under an investigation, a 15-6 investigation conducted by an Air Force officer here. So I don't want to get ahead of that investigation with regard to that specific incident. But there is a growing body of evidence that those types of things are happening. Human rights groups have done a lot of interviews. We have seen reportage of it from media who are on the ground that have discussed it with some of the victims of that. So yes, the enemy does continue to do that. It's a despicable tactic and unfortunate and heartbreaking, but it is something that we're seeing.
I just wanted to follow up on Paul's question really quickly. I know you don't want to speak necessarily to the regime's air operations, but the Russian Ministry of Defense today said that the cruise missile strikes had a direct effect on their campaign against ISIS. I know a few months ago, I think you said that you started to see an uptick in both the regime and Russia's airstrikes against ISIS due to fighting around Palmyra and Deir ez-Zor. Have you seen any impact on their efforts in recent days to fight ISIS? Are you seeing any activity by the Russians or the regime in Damascus to fight ISIS?
Yeah, as far as what the impact is against ISIS, I think that's something that we'll have to observe and see. What I would say is the strike was conducted because of the chemical weapons use against the people of Syria, and as a result, that they've had their capabilities reduced. So if they would like to continue to ramp up their campaign against ISIS, it would be best and in their interest to not use chemical weapons so that some of their capabilities will remain.
Since the cruise missile strike, have the Russian or Syrian regime forces made any threatening moves toward U.S. troops on the ground in Syria?
No.
Iranian forces or Iranian proxy forces?
No.
Can the American people expect any more U.S. troops going to Iraq or Syria anytime soon?
Well, I think that's a conversation for another day. As you know, the president has ordered a review of the campaign to determine what can be done to accelerate the campaign against ISIS. I understand that a shell of a plan is coming together, but as far as what might happen in the future, that is a discussion for another day. It's not something that we would speculate on from here.
Just a follow-up to your answer to Jamie McIntyre's question. You mentioned the airstrike in West Mosul on March 17th and the investigation into that. When can we expect a report?
Well, as you might imagine, with an incident of the high visibility nature and the possibly very difficult outcome there, there are going to be levels of review for the investigation result. So I don't want to get into an exact timeline for when that'll be done and when it'll be released. What I would say is I spoke with the investigating officer today, and he continues to gather information. He continues to speak with witnesses. I know that there's been some lab work conducted to try and look at some samples of various substances that were found around the sites. There have been engineers and experts brought in. There have been a lot of witnesses interviewed, including media who were present or had access to people in the scene in the time since the strike was conducted. So we continue to gather information. The intent is to get as comprehensive a picture as we possibly can about what's happened, and then to be as transparent as we can with regard to exactly what happened and what steps are needed in the follow-up from what's happened.
Just a quick follow-up. I mean, you mentioned transparency, and that's something that Lieutenant General Townsend mentioned as well. I mean, are you encouraging organizations like Amnesty to conduct their own investigations or perhaps get involved in or supply material to this investigation? And can you talk a bit about what you mean by transparency?
Well, we're going to release the results of our investigation. So, there are areas where there may be some classification of specific capabilities or that sort of thing, but we're going to release as much information as we can and give people a good picture of what's transpired. As far as the various groups that also review what's happened, I know that General Eisler has spoken with several of them, and he will continue to gather information from whatever sources he can to get as clear a picture as we can.
Colonel, U.S. troops were in close proximity with the Russians and regime forces in Manbij. And is this proximity still being kept, or does the U.S. forces still see the Russians around Manbij, or have you moved back them in a distant place as a measure of an adjustment to the force protection measure? Thank you.
No, our forces continue their work in that area, and nothing has really changed with regard to that.
Has the U.S. posture there changed in any way?
No.